It is here, folks. After popular demand in the community post, we are going to do this as a long video. There will be timestamps below for those of you that were hoping this would be short. This is going to be your Dragonflight prep with a brief touch up on the pre-patch and what that means, how it's going to affect some players. And if you want the full crash course on the pre-patch, please go see my sister video for this one. It is only about 6 minutes long, and that covers everything. So week commencing 24th of October, depending on your regional reset, you know when that is. Phase 1 of the pre-patch hits, and Season 4 of Shadowlands officially ends. So we'll get new talents, the UI revamp, a few accessibility features, which is your key bindings and stuff like that. Rated solo shuffle, so the solo shuffle brawl that we've been having fun with throughout the back end of Shadowlands is now a rated system, which does mean that we're going to be able to achieve our rival titles and all our rated achievements, credit towards vicious mounts, weekly vault progress, just like rated battlegrounds and arenas. That is now a thing. So solo queue, rejoice. We finally have an option for those of you that, for those of us that haven't quite been able to find arena partners. We also get the new class and race combinations. So finally we get those Tauren rogues, mages, and hell, even the Draenei get to stealth around a bit. Only taking them best part of 15 years, 17 if you're a Tauren, but at long last we get to play around with them. Phase 2 comes the week commencing the 14th of November, regional resets depending obviously, but that is where we get the new race class combination of Drakthea Evokers. We get the new zone as a result, the Forbidden Reach, which is obviously the Drakthea starting zone. We then get access to the new dungeon, Alderman, Legacy of Tyr, and the associated questline to go with that, which is the revamp dungeon for the one in the Badlands, for those of you that remember where it's located. And we also get the in-game event, which is called Primal Storms, and that's where we can get our transmogs-based currency and also catch-up gear at 252. Now, that's the pre-patch, or what we're getting in the pre-patch. In terms of what we're losing, Season 4 is obviously ending on the 25th, and that is just removing the chance to get titles. So if you're in the top 1% and you're after your Season 4 titles, that's when they'll be awarded. Keystone Master, Fated Mount, Fated Hero, and also the Mythic raid teleports will still be attainable during the pre-patch, so there's not too much to worry about. Now, I apologize for what's about to be a flashbang, but we need to go through it. So, the Dragonflight launch then is on the 28th of November worldwide. Now, in terms of a collector's impact, Mythic mounts are then going to have the lower drop chance. Obviously, at the moment and during the pre-patch, they still have the guaranteed chance to drop, with 2 dropping per Mythic raid from both Jailer and Sylvanas. That will continue during the pre-patch, but come Dragonflight itself, it will diminish. So the only impact will be a collector's issue. Try and get those mounts now while they're easy to attain. Now, the Dragonflight key elements that we need to concern ourselves with preparation-wise. Season 1 starts the week commencing 13th of December, with obviously the 14th being the American reset. Now, weirdly enough, for the first time in WoW's history, normal, heroic, and mythic raids are opening at the same time. This means if you're raiding, your raid/guild is going to need a plan. I have in brackets read splits, because the chances are you're likely to be diving in early to get as many tier sets from what bosses are easy to handle very early on. This is going to be very dependent on what things are tuned as, whether or not you're able to clear 1 wing, 2 wing, or if it's a hodgepodge of bosses that you try and cycle through. I do have the gearing lists that I've been able to attain, which we will go through once we have finished this particular page on screen. Now, Because the raid has fewer bosses in than what we're used to, this does mean that the weekly vault requirements have been lowered in terms of how many bosses need to be killed per segment of at least the raid portion of the weekly vault, and the rated PvP requirements have also been lowered. So that is just something that is going to be a nice quality of life improvement. Now, the week commencing 19th of December, 2nd of January, and the 16th of January respectively are when the Raid Finder wings open. Now, the gear level for Raid Finder, as you might be able to see on screen, is 376 to 385. Chances are, by the time that these wings open, most people will have attained this gear, because as you can see, we have a few elements of gear with various breakpoints in and around the situation. So we'll start with the outdoor progression, which is going to be the easy stuff that we're going to come across while we're both leveling, questing, and before Season 1 actually opens up. World quests are going to range from 340 to 356. Now, 356 is just below heroic dungeon level gear, so if you're constantly spamming out your random heroics during the start of Dragonflight, you're likely going to be able to get to the very top end of world quests anyway, so world quests probably aren't going to be particularly relevant, but there may be a few key trinket drops or bits of pieces that help shore up your gear quite quickly, which you may want to keep an eye out for. Storm Assaults are unique to Dragonflight. Think of them as kind of your key events out in the world. A drop at 359 initially, and then will eventually upgrade based on the difficulty of the assault up to 385, with World PvP dropping 366, Renown rewards dropping 376, and 376 obviously starts putting you at the lower end of Raid Finder gear. You then have the upper tier of Renown rewards being 389, dropping you into normal territory. Now, these mean that your early rewards from Renown, which is essentially your reputation in Dragonflight, means that you're going to be going kind of that Raid Finder into normal gear slots, with the world bosses dropping at 395, which puts you at the upper end of normal, not quite breaking into heroic territory, which is fine. For outdoor progression, that's perfectly fine and quite smooth. But likely, especially if you're looking to prep and climb quickly, you're going to be more interested in both the crafting, dungeon farming, and, key of all, where the Inspiration Catalyst sits. Here. Now, Blizzard have already announced that the Inspiration Catalyst, as it's being called in Dragonflight, is going to be about 6 weeks after Raid release. That means if Raid release is the 14th of December, we're looking at getting the Inspiration Catalyst week commencing the 23rd or the 30th of January. So back end of January is when we're going to see our Catalyst and the ability to transfer gear into the tier pieces that we need. Which means you're probably going to be wanting to hoard high item level pieces of gear probably a week or two prior to this, especially if they're key slots, because then you can very quickly stumbling over my words, you can then convert that immediately to fill a slot you need. Obviously, if you're a cloth wearer or something like that, we do have other things to consider, but as I said, once we've discussed item levels and what's on this page, we will discuss the gearing side of things, and a little bit on what that implies for your profession focus, as it were. But that's something to bear in mind. So, obviously, the 14th of December is Season 1's start, which then opens us up to our Mythic slots, and you can see here that in terms of item level, it actually goes all the way to Mythic 20, because Blizzard are changing the way that Mythic Plus works slightly. Not only is a 15 no longer the cap in terms of loot, they're also changing the way it scales. So a 15 in Dragonflight is going to be the equivalent of a 16 or a 17 in Shadowlands as we currently know it, but for top end loot, we're going to need to be able to do a Mythic 20. Which kind of sucks, because due to the same scaling issues that we have at a 15, we have them at a 20. So that means that a 20 in Dragonflight is going to be like doing a 22 or a 23 in Shadowlands currently, But as you can see by the reward cache, it really matters, especially early doors. So there are some brackets here, like from Mythic 10 to Mythic 13, where you just have the same loot chance at 392. Now, 392 puts you in the high end of normal in terms of dungeon loot, but it's very likely that attain is going to be achievable very, very early on. And because of this loot bracketing, a really, really strong recommendation for the early players among us that are looking to prep and climb quickly is getting into groups and farming 10s. Once you farm 10s and you have 392 in every slot, then you jump up to trying to do a 15 because you're going to want to do these lower brackets. You could attempt a 14, but the difference in loot between a 14 and a 15 for both your weekly chest and your end of dungeon chest means that for a little bit more effort, you get that slightly better gear. Because remember, 398 is the break point here for the end of normal, and we're going to want to try and get as much gear early doors as we can, and we're going to want it at a higher item level. The changes to raiding loot itself means that we are looking at essentially a pseudo return to master loot. We're actually getting group loot, but the way that a lot of the guilds are going to work this is you're basically going to have your raid leader greed everything, absolutely everything, and everyone else passes. This then allows that your raid leader and your officer team to dictate where the gear goes as it's required. Because another change to Blizzard's looting system is we are going to be able to trade anything, even if it's a higher item level than what we currently have. They did release it in a blue post, and as things currently stand in testing, that is still available. So it's no longer going to be a case of you get a 3 item level upgrade, but that 3 item level upgrade is actually garbage for you because it's got horrendous stats, or it's on a piece that you don't need. You then kind of stuck with it. Alternatively, someone else in your raid roster could really do with it. So we kind of have master loot back, but we don't. It's a little bit hit and miss. So chances are that's how raids are going to run it. This does mean that outside of raiding, there's going to be a few priorities. Now, in previous videos, we have discussed how crafting works, and I've gone into depth about it, and we've kind of broken down how things work. But as you can see with the crafting brackets, they're a little bit iffy. The matrix 4 here, because there are multiple matrices within the crafting system, these drop from dungeons and things like that, and these allow you to augment your crafts between 372 and 382. Now, that is a nice bridge within the raid finder and will slowly get you into kind of like bottom end normal territory, especially if you're using other bits and pieces and things like that, which is fine. This means that you can very, very quickly, if you have the funds, get yourself geared. Now, when I discuss funds, I'll explain why funds are going to be important when we discuss this little bit that you can see in the top right of the screen. But the key bit for early progression is actually going to get into the normal epic crafting or the heroic epic crafting, which puts us in the 382 to the 395 or the 395 to 405 item level brackets. And the reason for this is because there are some professions that have really strong key crafts that are going to affect certain classes. So you've got inscription, you've got alchemy, which both are renowned for strong trinkets. Inscription obviously has its Darkmoon decks, and the Darkmoon decks are huge. They have a tradition of this at this point of being immensely powerful season 1, and they kind of tail off season 2, season 3 of an expansion. And with the change to crafting so that you have these tiers, I suspect, especially if you can be very, very quick to craft something or get something like a mythic level, like 418 craft version of a Darkmoon deck, you're going to be walking to the bank laughing. Because that is huge. Because realistically, and again, we'll discuss gearing in a minute, the options for gearing, especially from mythic raid level, are rather slim pickings. So shoring up your gear through something like crafting or through the weekly, through Mythic Plus is going to be something that you need to keep an eye out for. Now, crafting specifically, we have crafting knowledge. Now, crafting knowledge is what forces you into your crafting specializations. Now, for those of you that remember, we did have a coverage of all of this quite some time back, which put us in this scenario where I covered all the talks and discussed kind of what a priority system may look like for guilds, going through alchemy, cooking, engineering, jewel crafting, inscription, enchanting, and tailoring. And as you can see, tailoring is currently showing up as red on this particular list. And this is because this very much boils down to what your roster looks like. Because unfortunately for us clothies, we have a 2-set to juggle with our tier sets. And that is the Azure Weave or Chrono Cloth set. These are your embellished, more powerful crafts. This does obviously limit what else we can have embellished, because much like the Warlords of Draenor crafting system, embellished gear has a limit of 2 equipped embellished pieces at a time, so you can't deck everything out with these empowerments. But for draconic needlework and tailors, the Azure Weave has a chance to grant you intellect if you're dealing damage, or grant you mana if you're healing, while the Chronocloth set stores up a buff, and then once you hit 15 stacks of that buff, it releases it and gives you a large amount of haste for a period of time. So depending on sims and how things look as balancing as we go into the raid, having the 2-set of either Azure Weave or Chronocloth will be a very good augmentation to the tier sets anyway. But this is going to be more impactful if you have a large cloth roster, for instance. From a solo player perspective, it's very much up to you. You could have tailoring if you want and craft your own and make some money on the side, because it will be popular early doors. Alternatively, you can go something like inscription. Now, going back from this and discussing knowledge itself, you have a few things to bear in mind. So you have, how do we get knowledge and its sources? So you have first time crafts. The first time you craft something, you are awarded 1 knowledge point for it. You then have access to Draconic Scribe books. These are a 1 per week cooldown that award you 1 point. Inscriptionists can make them, and it's very likely that this is going to be quite a good money spinner for inscriptionists in general, especially if you can get to these early, because although it's only 1 point per week, it does make a difference long term, and a lot of people are going to be rushing for their epic crafts. Because I do have on the officer sheet for us, I have a breakdown of where things roughly are going to take and how long they're going to take to get there. So kind of a raid ready ETA. Now, I can't show you that particular tab, but I know what's on it. So I will obviously discuss it while, you get to see my pretty face. But that aside, you then have one-time treasures. These are spread throughout the course of Dragonflight zones, just out in the world. And depending on the profession you have, they're obviously profession specific, so whether they be molten ingots, certain enchanting piles of dust and motes, things like that. And each of these award 2 to 3 knowledge per find, as it were. So if you go round and pick them all up, you can get a very, very early boost in your knowledge. You then have dragon shards. These are limited to roughly 3 per week at the moment, and each one, after converting them via a NPC, you get 1 knowledge and some artisan's metal. Artisan's metal is quite useful for a lot of things. It's used in various crafts, and it's a conversion for a vendor in Valdrakken called Rabul. He trades artisan's metal for knowledge, and these are a rep-based thing. Depending on the amount you give him will depend on how much artifact knowledge you get. Now, crafters and gatherers, as things currently stand, get differing amounts, with crafters gaining 10 knowledge per trade-in and gatherers gaining 15. You then have one-time quests, which are with the Artisans Consortium, essentially. And once you've done these quests, you get 3 or 4 dragon shards, which obviously just converts to 3 or 4 knowledge, and some artisan's metal on the side. You then also get 3 per completion of work order quests. Now, work orders haven't exactly been testable over the beta, but they have put us in a position where Blizzard are really going to try and push this down crafters' necks. And unfortunately, it's something that if you want your gear early, you are going to have to take part in. This is going to be very, very consumer dependent, because you're going to have to try and work out what the most efficient way to complete these crafting orders are, because people can provide or limit how many resources they give you. So how many of the resources are you actually, as the crafter, going to provide in order to fill these out? It's a bit of a mire, but on average, the knowledge per week is going to sit you at somewhere between 10 or 15 knowledge per week on average, with maybe a few bursts early on in terms of one-time treasures and kind of just how lucky you are in terms of map exploration early on. There's probably going to be a lot of guides out for the profession side of things when it comes to maxing out your knowledge. But what this does mean is, especially for things like your inscriptions, your alchemists, if you're going for the cauldrons, because again, side note, harking back to the profession video, the cauldrons are no longer flasks, they're potions instead, with flasks taking a brief hiatus and we're getting vials instead. But if you're going to be an alchemist and providing your raid roster with the cauldron, on average it is going to take you 2 to 3 weeks to be able to unlock the cauldron. That's just from a knowledge perspective and not from any other rep based things that we need to worry about. The same goes with scribing, because in order to unlock the first tier of Darkmoon decks, you are going to need to sink 30 points into your Darkmoon deck. Well, that's not entirely true. You'll actually be able to make your Darkmoon deck the 372 version, so the very, very basic epic craft, which kind of fits into your Matrix 4 area. You're actually going to be able to do that very, very quickly, because when you go into archiving, you sink your 10 points into it, and then you unlock your Darkmoon Mysteries, which allows you to RNG create your Darkmoon cards. However, 1 to 2 weeks later, you're then going to be able to create the upper end, which is your Darkmoon deck box, of a certain type. This then gets you into your fire, your tank, your like DPS ones, because you've got both Rhyme and Infernal, or you've got Dancing and Watchers, which is your tank and healer types. But this is also going to be the case for things like Tailors. So on average, you're looking at 2 to 3 weeks to start getting into something and making sure that, you know, you can craft what you need to. So if you're not fussed in terms of money, like if money is not a problem, you have a bit of breathing space in terms of your gearing, because you will have some epic gear by the time season 1 opens. Like that's kind of the game plan. Now we're going to take cloth gearing as an example here, and this is the screen we're looking at. There's a fair bit to process. I haven't done the loot table for Shadowmoon Burial Grounds or Temple of the Jade Serpent. The reason for this is because WoD dungeons are notorious for having everything. It is better to kind of look at that loot table and be like, right, okay, what doesn't it have? Because the amount of necks, the rings, and the various stack combinations it has beggars belief. And Temple of the Jade Serpent, for some reason on the beta, the loot table just wasn't showing. So I thought to leave it, because that dungeon has been updated, because it will be in the Season 1 rotation. However, looking at the raid, you can see the gear is actually really sparse. The drop totals, and this goes the same for every class, is there's 2 helms that drop, one being a tier token and one being a mastery crit token, or mastery crit helm. You then have 2 necks, 2 shoulders, 2 backs, 2 chests, 1 wrist, 2 sets of gloves, 1 belt, 2 sets of legs, 1 pair of boots, 2 rings, 6 intellect based trinkets, 1 two-handed staff, and then you've got 2 main hands and 2 off hands for cloth wielders. And it's the same story for male, 2 2 2 2 2, then 1 2 1 2 1, with obviously a spread in terms of like 7 DPS strength / agi trinkets, 6 intellect ones, 2 agility based two-handed weapons, 1 intellect two-handed weapon, obviously a stave. You then have 5 DPS main hands, with 1 being glaives, and then you have 2 off hands as well. Now, male, again, it's this kind of the same in terms of your actual gearing options. A lot of your gear, no matter what armor type you are, is going to be focused around your Mythic Plus pool. Now, as we discussed, going back to the end of dungeon loot, the maximum weekly chest rewards is 421 from doing a 20. Now, it's 415 if you manage to do a 16 or a 17, and it's 411 if you complete a weekly 15. This means that doing at least a 16 will get you base level mythic gear. Now, if we go back to cloth gearing, this means that 415 as your weekly loot will immediately knock out the first 4 bosses out of 8. Because Blizzard's raid looting system is changing slightly. So you're going to have start of wing bosses, your end of wing bosses, and your final bosses of the raid. This means that essentially you're going to have 2 bosses, so Enog and Taros, that are 415, and then that leads into Denethia the Ascended, whose loot table is 421 at Mythic. So you have a loot jump essentially of 415, 421, and then 424, which is your upper end. However, there are 2 items within the raid that actually break this. You have the ring that drops off the first boss, Eranog, that drops at a higher item level at 421. So it puts it on par with both Kurag Grim Totem and Denethia the Ascended. And then you have a 430 ring that drops from Broodkeeper Durnia. And that is pretty big. Pretty big. However, there is another item as well for the male wearers. And that is a 430 bow that drops. So unfortunately, hunters, you yet again have a bow that you need to chase. There is a staff specific to evokers as well, but that comes from Broodkeeper herself and doesn't come at a higher item level. That's still 424, but it is evoker only because it has a unique effect that feeds into your mastery, which is quite nice. So there's 2 items in the raid that drop at 430, and there's 1 that drops very early on, that's 421, which puts it at end of wing boss. But even so, taking that into account, you have 8 dungeons where you'll be able to get better itemized gear with better variations. Because one thing to highlight from raid gearing before we do move up to the dungeons is a lot of it is verse heavy. Now, my theory around why a lot of the gear in Dragonflight Season 1 is going to be verse heavy is because people are now playing new specs. As you know, we're getting new talents in the pre-patch, and that is going to change how certain classes interact and how certain classes feel and play. Which means that the tier bonuses themselves are all relatively boring. There's nothing too fancy happening. It's, poison increased damage, or, Demon Bolt does more damage, and your Demon Bolts have a chance to give you a instant cast Hand of Gul'dan. It doesn't change the fact Hand of Gul'dan is going to cost you 1 to 3 shards depending on when you use it. It just is now instant cast and hits a little bit harder. So you're not really going to feel much different, especially with things like the 2 sets. But by having versatility, it kind of gives Blizzard a much easier way to just go, right, okay, well, we'll just tweak things a little bit as we play things through. However, for the Mythic Plus loot table, we have a much better range of things like, you know, crit mastery, for instance, a lot of gear for Halls of Valor, a lot of the non-rings and things, so like wrists, gloves, belt, legs, they are all crit mastery from Halls of Valor. So if you're playing Hunter and you're BM, for instance, and you want that crit mastery, Halls of Valor is a really good dungeon for you to go run, and if you're able to run 20s all the time, you'll be able to just come away with 4 or 5 gear from that. And it'll let you shore up your gear. Alternatively, for Clothies, we have Haste Mastery from Ruby Life Pools, both in the form of back and belt, which obviously, depending on which 2-set we're juggling, can be useful. Legs aren't too bad. We've got some nice options in terms of weapons as well, but you can kind of see that the loot system, at least, in terms of if you want a lot of gear, is definitely going to come from the Mythic Plus side of things, or going back to crafting, which kind of makes sense due to Blizzard's change in Dragonflight of moving things around and how things are looking in terms of what is considered to be a pillar of the game. We're likely to see this deviation of where things are coming from. So it's no longer a case of you have to get everything from raid. Because if we take Warlocks as a prime example, if 421 is weekly stuff, the end goal, realistically, paired with crafting at 418, is we're likely to have our, say, Chronocloth gear at 418, to ensure our 2-set. We're then likely to ensure that we have tier helm and tier shoulders at 424 from both Broodkeeper and Razgeth. We're then going to want the 430 ring, and then obviously the 424 boot. Chronocloth is boots, so we won't want the boots. But then you can see that we're probably going to then just want to fill out the rest with 421 stuff. Like 421 does give us the hands and tier from Deathia or Grim, but there's every possibility that we just go, actually no, we'll just take it from here instead. So unless you're pushing to the very end and getting your cutting edge, you're likely to spend more time doing Mythic Plus, or look at your crafting gear for loot rather than what's actually on a raid table, because it's so sparse. The only exception being obviously Hunters. I really feel sorry for you, that bow is bonkers, because it does also have an equip perk, which is, off the top of my head, it basically increases your auto attack speed while you're fighting something, which is just daft. So taking all that, all the information about gearing and how everything looks, what is the best thing you as a player can do to prepare? And simply put, what is your end goal for Dragonflight? Are you looking at taking raiding more seriously? Are you looking at taking Mythic Plus seriously? Do you want to just make money? Because early doors for Dragonflight, one of the best ways for you to make money is to go gathering. Because the first 2 weeks of Dragonflight, you are going to make so much money through the gathering professions. And not even just from the gathering professions in the traditional sense of skinning, herbing, and mining, but also from being able to convert your tailoring. Because there, remember, going back to the profession video I did, there are elements within tailoring that increase the drop rate of what you want, or what drops. So like being able to get more cloth from humanoid mobs, being able to get random bolts, being able to convert motes, essentially, because there is a mote reagent. You combine 10 into a more powerful thing, and that's your awakened resource. Being able to convert all of that and being able to put it on the auction house early is going to be a huge improvement. So let me know in the comments below what you guys are after and kind of what you want from Dragonflight, and let me know if this video helped you at all, because I appreciate nearly 40 minutes long and there's been a lot to digest. Now, I'll leave it here. And when we get into the pre-patch, I will be releasing the talent guides and kind of what the pre-patch looks like from an actual player perspective. And I hope to see you all in game very soon. Until the next time, folks, take care and have a good one.